He offered $1 if the boy could heal him. Then came the shock of his life. When a wealthy billionaire mocks a young boy's claim to heal him, he offers $1 million as a joke. But the moment the boy reaches out his hand, something impossible happens, changing both of their lives forever. This emotional, true-to-life style story explores pride, humility, and the power of kindness. Hey friends, welcome back to Cracks of Light. Here we share powerful, heart-touching stories that remind us kindness, courage, and hope are still alive in the world. If you want to help us bring more of these meaningful stories to life, please hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Your support gives us the motivation to keep sharing light with the world. It was one of those crisp Saturdays in Maplewood, Ohio, where the park smells faintly of fresh-cut grass and grilled hot dogs from the Little League concession stand. I was parked under the big elm near the basketball courts, nursing a black coffee in a paper cup that had already gone lukewarm. Across the way, a handful of kids had turned the picnic area into their own little ER, wrapping each other in paper towels like bandages, pretending to write prescriptions on napkins. Ethan Grant, the Ethan Grant, was there too. You couldn't miss him. The man sat in a sleek motorized wheelchair like it was a throne on wheels, wearing a pressed navy blazer over a t-shirt that probably cost more than my month's rent. He had the kind of smirk that made you feel like you just said something dumb, even if you hadn't spoken yet. I heard him before I saw him roll up to the kids. "Future scam artists, huh?" he said, his voice carrying across the park. "Practicing how to take people's money for nothing." The kids froze, unsure if this was some kind of joke. One boy in particular, Caleb, just stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on Ethan. He didn't flinch, didn't glance away. Most adults can't hold Ethan's stare for more than a second. Caleb lasted long enough to make Ethan shift in his seat. "You gonna just stand there looking at me?" Ethan taunted. "Or you gonna work a miracle?" "Tell you what," he leaned in, lowering his voice like he was letting Caleb in on a secret. "You cure me, kid. I'll write you a check for $1 million. A couple of moms nearby shook their heads, muttering something about poor taste. But Caleb didn't blink. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Get your check ready." I swear you could hear the flag flapping on the Little League field all the way across the park. Ethan laughed, but it wasn't his usual sharp, confident laugh. It was just a hair too loud, too forced. And for the first time that morning, I thought maybe, just maybe, the king of Maplewood real estate didn't have the upper hand. Caleb didn't say yes or no. He just stepped forward with that slow, deliberate walk kids get when they're deciding something important. The knees of his jeans were worn thin and frayed, the kind of denim that's been through more than one owner. He lowered himself onto the cracked blacktop without hesitation, one knee making a soft scrape against the pavement. He set his left hand flat on the ground, palm pressed to the rough surface like he was grounding himself. His right hand came up, hovering for a second before resting gently on Ethan's leg, just above the knee, fingers barely curling around the side. He looked like he was listening for a heartbeat in the muscle. The park noises seemed to fade. A football practice was going on over at the high school field, and somewhere in the distance, you could hear the metallic thump of a screen door from one of the houses across Main Street. Even so, the air between those two stayed unnervingly still. Caleb's lips moved, forming words too soft for anyone to catch. It might have been a prayer. It might have been something else entirely. Ethan shifted in his chair, glancing toward a couple of moms at the picnic tables who were whispering. He was used to being the one who made other people uncomfortable, not the other way around. "That's it? You gonna hum at me, kid?" he said, voice just a little sharper than usual. Caleb opened his eyes, stood up, and brushed the grit from his hands. He didn't break eye contact, but he didn't offer a single word either. He just turned, walked past the hot dog cart, past the old wooden bandstand with its peeling white paint, and was gone. Ethan sat there, staring after him. For a man who'd built his fortune knowing how to close every deal, the lack of a clear ending to that moment itched at him. "Strange kid," he muttered, finally turning his chair toward the parking lot. But deep down, something about the steadiness in those eyes stayed with him. That night, his penthouse felt bigger than usual. The glass walls looked out over the Maplewood River, its dark surface catching the glow from the street lamps below. He had the evening news on, the anchor talking about the latest blow-up at the town council, some zoning dispute that had half the Chamber of Commerce in a fury, but the words drifted past him. He poured a bourbon, let it sit on the coffee table, untouched. That's when he felt it. At first, just a faint tickle in his left foot. He thought it was nothing, a nerve twitch, a circulation blip, but then it grew warmer, climbing past his ankle. He sat forward, frowning, pressing a hand to his thigh. It was warm, really warm. His pulse picked up, 5 years in a chair, and nothing had stirred below his waist in all that time. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe it's the way I'm sitting. Maybe I've just been pushing harder on the footrest. But the longer it went on, the more his mind kept circling back to that boy in the park, his hand resting exactly there. The bourbon sat forgotten. The news kept droning about budget overruns and noise ordinances. But Ethan heard none of it, just the quiet in the park, the boy's steady gaze, and the slow, impossible feeling of something waking up in his legs. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Grant didn't feel in control. The doctors didn't have much to say. Ethan had rolled into Maplewood General for the first time in years with something he thought would make their jaws drop. "I've got sensation back in my legs," he told them, leaning forward in the exam room like he was handing over insider stock tips. They ran the tests, neurological, vascular, the whole battery, nodded, frowned, tapped tablets. The neurologist, a thin woman in her 50s who looked like she'd been up since the Carter administration, finally shrugged and said, "There's no medical explanation. Spinal injuries don't just reverse, but sometimes the body surprises us. Surprises us." He hated that phrase. In business, surprises meant someone screwed up or someone lied. In medicine, apparently, it was just a mystery everyone agreed to stop asking about. By the third day, Ethan's impatience boiled over. He didn't care about clinical write-ups or anomalous case studies. He wanted the boy. Caleb. Finding him wasn't as easy as he thought. Maplewood wasn't a big place, but it had pockets, trailer parks by the highway, converted motels out on the state road, half-empty apartment buildings where names changed faster than the seasons. Ethan asked around at the park first. Most parents just said, "Oh, the quiet one? Don't think he goes to our school." The hot dog vendor remembered him, said he always asked for mustard, but never bought anything. Someone else usually covered him. On the 5th day, after a string of dead ends, Ethan spotted a man sitting on the curb outside a shuttered gas station, cradling a paper cup of coffee. His coat was army surplus, his beard uneven, and his boots had the wear of years on the road. Ethan recognized him. Frank, a veteran who showed up at community board meetings sometimes, usually to ask if anyone had spare blankets for the winter shelter. Ethan rolled up and got straight to it. "You seen a boy named Caleb? About yay high? Dark hair, doesn't say much." Frank sipped, considered. "Yeah, think I know the one. Lives with his grandma at the old Methodist shelter by the river. Church runs it on fumes." Ethan frowned. "The brick place by the old train depot? That's the one. Back entrance is by the basketball hoop with no net." It was barely noon, but the sky was already bruising towards snow. Ethan drove himself down there. No chauffeur, no assistant, just him and the quiet hum of the SUV. The shelter sat hunched between the depot and a scrapyard, its red bricks soot-stained, the front steps patched with plywood. A wooden cross leaned over the door like it had been set there decades ago and never moved. He rang the bell. A woman's voice called, 1 second, and then the door cracked open. She was maybe late 60s, with silver hair tied back and eyes that didn't flinch. "Yes? I'm looking for Caleb," Ethan said. "My name's Ethan Grant." The name landed. She didn't smile. "I'm Mary Carter. Caleb's my grandson." "What's this about?" Ethan took a breath. "I met him in the park last week. He helped me, and I need to talk to him. Mary studied him, the way someone sizes up a salesman before deciding whether to shut the door." "Helped you how?" He hesitated. "I can't explain it, but before I met him, I couldn't stand. And now..." He stepped back and stood on the porch, letting the cane he'd brought hang loosely in his hand. Mary's eyebrows rose, but her voice stayed flat. "Come inside." The shelter's hallway was narrow, lined with mismatched chairs and bulletin boards layered with years of flyers. Somewhere in the building, kids were laughing. Quick bursts of it, like the sound of marbles hitting a floor. The air smelled faintly of chili and laundry soap. She led him to a small office, shut the door, and sat behind a metal desk stacked with folders. You know, most of the folks here used to live over on Pine Grove, she said. Whole block was tight-knit. Families, small shops, a barber shop that's been there 50 years. I don't know Pine Grove, Ethan said. Mary's eyes locked on his. That's because it's not there anymore. Your company bought it out. Promised redevelopment. All we got were bulldozers and eviction notices. The words hit harder than he expected. That was my company, yes, but I retired. She opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folded, yellowed newspaper. Spread it on the desk between them. There, above the fold, Ethan Grant cuts ribbon on riverfront luxury condos. He was smiling in the photo, hand in hand with the mayor, shovels lined up in front of a construction site. He swallowed. I never saw names, faces. It was numbers on a spreadsheet. I thought. Mary's voice tightened. You thought it was progress. We thought it was home. For a long moment, the only sound was the radiator ticking in the corner. Ethan stared at the picture. The suit he wore in that shot was still in his closet. He remembered the champagne toast afterward, the way the city paper called it a new era for Maplewood's waterfront. He didn't remember asking who lived there before. I came here to thank Caleb, he said finally, to pay him back. Mary leaned back, folded her arms. Pay him back how? I told him $1 million if he could fix me. He did. I have the check ready. Her mouth pressed into a line. You want to help? Help everyone in this building. We've got 50 people sleeping in a space meant for 20. Kids doing homework on the floor. People working 2 jobs and still lining up for dinner here. Ethan glanced toward the hallway, where the sound of children's voices swelled and faded again. Something shifted in his chest. Not pity, not exactly guilt, but the sick weight of recognition. He looked back at the photo, his own grin frozen under the headline. For years, he'd prided himself on never letting emotion cloud a deal. Now the deal was staring back at him in newsprint, and all he could see were the people it had erased. Caleb was in the back of the shelter, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a chessboard that had more mismatched pieces than original ones. A little girl with hair in messy pigtails was his opponent, and judging by the way she was grinning, she'd just taken his queen. Ethan waited until the game ended, if you could call it that, before stepping forward. His cane clicked softly on the scuffed linoleum. Hey, Caleb, he said, his voice a little too formal, like he was about to pitch a client. I owe you something. Caleb looked up, expression unreadable. You don't owe me. Ethan pulled an envelope from inside his blazer. He'd chosen a plain white one, no bank logo, no gold foil, but the weight of it was unmistakable. He crouched as far as his knee would allow and held it out. $1 million. Like I promised. The kids nearby stopped whispering and stared. A few adults across the room glanced over. Mary Carter, standing by the coffee urn, didn't move, but her eyes sharpened. Caleb didn't take the envelope. What would I do with $1 million? He asked, almost curious, like he wanted to see what Ethan would say. You could buy a house, go to college anywhere you want. Take care of your grandmother, Ethan offered, hearing how hollow it sounded even as the words left his mouth. Caleb shook his head once. If you really want to help, fix this place. Help them. He nodded toward the rest of the room. Ethan followed his gaze. The shelter's common area was smaller than he'd noticed when he came in. Just a handful of tables, chairs that didn't match, walls patched with different shades of paint. A sleeping mat was rolled up in the corner, but 3 others were spread out already, thin blankets folded at the ends. A toddler toddled past with one sock on, clutching a plastic dinosaur missing an arm. He realized then he'd walked into the middle of their lives, not as a rescuer, not even as a guest, but as someone whose shadow already stretched over them. Someone who'd played a part in them being here in the first place. Mary's voice cut into his thoughts. We've got families sleeping in shifts. If one person's working nights, someone else uses their mat during the day. The ceiling leaks every time it rains, the furnace kicks out every other week, and our food pantry is empty by Thursday. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it in front of a man who looked like he'd been up since dawn. Ethan glanced back at Caleb, but the boy had returned to his chess game, sliding a rook into place. The conversation was over for him. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like the most powerful man in the room. He slipped the envelope back into his pocket, suddenly aware of how ridiculous it felt, like trying to pay off a storm with a stack of cash. Money could buy a lot, but it couldn't unflood a street or replant a tree once the bulldozers had come. There was a time when Ethan would have deflected, thrown out some comment about how redevelopment is good for the tax base or change is always hard for communities. He'd said things like that at city council receptions, shaking hands over catered shrimp trays, making deals in the corner while someone's kid played piano in the background. But in that shelter, the usual script didn't fit. These weren't numbers in a column. They were people. People who remembered where they lived before the condos. People who still had the keys to doors that no longer existed. He wandered to the hallway and peeked into one of the sleeping rooms. It was barely larger than his old office closet, with 2 cots and a dresser missing a drawer. A woman sat on the edge of one cot, reading from a library book to a boy curled up beside her. She looked up just long enough to give him a polite smile, the kind you give a stranger in church, before turning back to the page. In another corner of the building, a group of teenagers huddled around a charging station, taking turns with 2 phones. The walls here were lined with donations, coats on wire hangers, a box of sneakers with mismatched laces, stacks of canned soup. Mary joined him in the hallway. "Most of us didn't plan to end up here," she said quietly. "Some worked construction until the company folded. Some cleaned offices for folks who never learned their names. But when Pine Grove went, we all went." Ethan leaned on his cane, eyes tracing the peeling paint along the baseboard. He thought about the way he used to measure success. Square footage sold, quarterly gains, headlines in the business section. None of that measured what he was looking at now. Back in the main room, Caleb had switched to playing cards with a younger boy. Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure whether to stay or leave. The air was warm from the overworked radiators, and the smell of chili drifted in from the kitchen. Someone was laughing softly over by the coffee pot. He thought about the board meetings where they'd approved the Pine Grove deal, about the catered sandwiches, the little jars of Dijon mustard no one used, the polite applause after the vote. No one mentioned the people. Not once. Now he knew their faces. He looked at Mary. What would fixing this place look like? She didn't answer right away. Depends. Are you asking as a businessman or as a man who wants to make something right? For once, he didn't have a prepared line. Maybe both. Then start with the roof, she said. Then the furnace. Then we'll talk about the rest. It wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation. And maybe the closest thing to forgiveness he was going to get. 3 days after Ethan's visit to the shelter, the first snow of the season dusted the town. It wasn't much, just enough to turn the cracked sidewalks into patchwork quilts of white and shadow, but it made the air sharp and the sky heavy. Ethan had been at his office all morning, staring at a building proposal he couldn't bring himself to sign. Every time he picked up the pen, Caleb's voice came back. If you really want to help, fix this place. By late afternoon, he decided to stop by the shelter again. Mary always made coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since dawn, but there was something grounding about it. He was halfway down the block when he saw the ambulance lights flicker red across the snow. Inside, the scene was chaos, but not loud chaos. It was the urgent, compressed kind. People speaking in clipped sentences, kids shuffled out of the way, the smell of overcooked chili still lingering in the air. Mary lay on the floor near the serving table, her apron askew, a ladle still in her hand. Caleb was on his knees beside her, his hands pressed to her stomach like he could will her to wake up. His lips moved in a whisper, the same rhythm Ethan remembered from that night by the diner. But this time, nothing happened. "Come on, Grandma. Please," Caleb's voice cracked, breaking through the murmur of the crowd. A paramedic crouched down, gently pulling Caleb's hands away. "We've got her, son." Ethan moved before he could think, stepping forward to help lift Mary onto the stretcher. She felt light, too light. Caleb tried to climb in after her, but the paramedic shook his head. "Family can follow us in a separate car." "I'm coming," Ethan said firmly, looking at Caleb. "We're going together." The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and streetlights bending through the cold. Caleb sat silent in the passenger seat, staring at his hands. Ethan gripped the wheel harder than necessary, mind racing through possibilities. Heart attack, stroke, something else entirely. At the ER, the antiseptic smell hit him like a slap. Nurses in scrubs, the color of ocean water, moved briskly, their shoes squeaking against the tile. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, a doctor in his 40s approached, his face professional but tired. "Her kidneys are failing," he said, glancing between them. "This didn't happen overnight. She's been sick for a while. She'll need dialysis immediately, but long-term," he hesitated. "Long-term, she'll need a transplant." Ethan's stomach dropped. "How long does she have?" The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. "Without a donor match? Not long." Caleb's head snapped toward Ethan. "You have to fix it," he said, almost accusing. "You fixed you. Why not her?" His voice cracked again, and before Ethan could answer, Caleb's eyes filled. "Why did it work for you, and not her?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, he didn't know. That night at the diner, Caleb's touch had been like a spark, something impossible, something no doctor could explain. But now, in the cold glare of the hospital, it was just gone. He reached for the boy's shoulder. "Caleb." "No," Caleb pulled away, shaking his head. "If you really want to help, then help her." His words echoed in the sterile hallway, sharper than any boardroom argument Ethan had ever been in. A nurse came to lead them to the waiting room. It was half empty, with vinyl chairs arranged around a low table stacked with dog-eared magazines. The TV on the wall played muted footage of a high school basketball game. The scoreboard frozen in the corner of the screen. They sat in silence for a while. Across the room, a man in work boots rubbed his hands together like he was trying to start a fire. A teenage girl in a winter coat scrolled through her phone, earbuds in. The smell of burnt coffee wafted from a vending machine. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He thought about Mary's kitchen at the shelter. How she always made sure everyone else got served before she sat down. How she cut grilled cheese into triangles for the littlest kids. How she'd called him Mr. Ethan, like they'd known each other for years. He also thought about the Pine Grove deal again. How, in one afternoon, they'd decided the fate of an entire neighborhood without looking anyone in the eye. Mary had been in that neighborhood, so had Caleb, and all the others sleeping on mats now. When the doctor returned, his update was clinical. Mary was stable for the moment, but the clock was ticking. Ethan listened, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd spent years telling himself that his work, his buildings, his projects were about progress. But progress for who? Caleb was slouched in the chair beside him, hoodie pulled tight, eyes fixed on the floor. Ethan realized then that this was the test, not the kind you passed by writing a check, not even the kind you could charm your way through with the right words. This was about doing the work, the hard, messy, uncomfortable work of making things right. A thought began to form. Half an idea, really, but stubborn enough not to let go. He didn't say it out loud yet, not until he was sure. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't thinking about quarterly projections or market trends. He was thinking about one woman, one boy, and one building on the edge of town that deserved a better fate. And somewhere in that waiting room, between the flicker of the muted basketball game and the hum of the vending machine, Ethan Carter decided he wasn't leaving this one to chance. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The hospital's plastic waiting room chair had pressed into his back for hours, but it wasn't the discomfort that kept him awake. It was the image of Caleb in that hoodie, sitting hunched in the corner like the world had just proven him right about everything bad it had to offer. When dawn light leaked through the frosted window, Ethan stood, stretching the stiffness out of his legs, and went straight to the nurse's station. "I want to be tested," he said. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with silver streaks in her hair and the kind of calm that only came from decades in ER chaos, looked up from her computer. "Tested? For the kidney transplant. For Mary Carter." She raised her eyebrows. "You're not family?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but I'm here, and I want to know if I can help." By mid-morning, they had him in a small lab room, taking blood, checking charts, typing into a system that felt painfully slow. Every beep of the machine was a drumbeat in his head. Ethan was used to making calls on multi-million-dollar projects in under 10 minutes. But this was out of his hands. While he waited, he wandered to the cafeteria for coffee. The place smelled like burnt toast and industrial cleaner. Two men in county maintenance uniforms were arguing about whether the high school football team should replace its coach, their voices low but heated. Nearby, A woman in a church choir sweater was knitting while her pager sat next to her tray. Life in a small town was like that. You couldn't step into a public space without bumping into someone who knew someone you knew. The politics of the place were never far away. He overheard a snippet about the upcoming community board meeting, how they were going to finally vote on that zoning change by the river. Once, Ethan would have been interested only if the change could pad his portfolio. Now, all he could think was how many Marys might get pushed out if the vote went the wrong way. Around noon, the doctor returned, holding a clipboard like it weighed something. "You're a match," he said simply. For a second, Ethan thought he'd misheard. "I am?" "It's rare, but it happens," the doctor confirmed. "You're compatible. We'd still need to run a few more panels, but this is, well, it's a real shot." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then we do it." The doctor's face stayed neutral. "Mr. Carter, I need you to understand this is major surgery. It's not without risk. Complications can happen. Recovery can take weeks. You'd be down for a while." No business meetings, no travel. Ethan cut him off with a small, humorless smile. "The biggest risk is that kid losing the only family he has." The doctor studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious. But Ethan's gaze didn't waver. By the time he walked back into the waiting area, Caleb was awake, curled sideways in one of the chairs, head against the wall. His eyes cracked open when Ethan sat down. "What'd they say?" Caleb's voice was rough from sleep. "I'm a match," Ethan said, keeping his tone steady. For a second, Caleb just stared at him like he wasn't sure whether to believe it. "And you'd do that? For her?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, for her. For you." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering. "Why?" Ethan thought about lying, giving some easy answer about gratitude or paying it forward. But instead he said, "Because I've spent a lot of years building things that didn't matter half as much as I told myself they did. And this matters." The boy didn't reply right away, but the tight line of his shoulders eased just a little. The next couple of days blurred into a mix of pre-op tests, hospital paperwork, and conversations Ethan never imagined himself having. A transplant coordinator came in to walk him through the process. She spoke in that practiced, careful tone people use when they're talking to someone who might back out at the last minute. "Your kidney will take over part of her function immediately, but there's still the risk her body could reject it," she said. "Are you prepared for that possibility?" Ethan didn't even glance at Caleb, who sat in the corner listening. "I'm prepared for all of it." One evening, Mary woke briefly. She was pale, eyes glassy, but when she saw Ethan sitting beside her bed, she gave him a faint smile. "You again," she whispered. "Me again," Ethan said softly. "I hear you're trying to play hero." "Not a hero," he replied. "Just someone who finally got his priorities straight." Mary's smile lingered for a moment before her eyes closed again. That night, Ethan walked Caleb down to the hospital's small chapel. It wasn't much. Just a room with wooden pews, a few stained glass panels, and the faint scent of lemon polish. A Christmas wreath still hung above the doorway, even though it was nearly February. "I used to come in here when my dad was sick," Caleb said quietly. "Thought maybe if I prayed hard enough, he'd get better." He shrugged. Didn't work. Ethan looked around the dim space. Sometimes you get the thing you asked for. Sometimes you get something else entirely. Caleb glanced at him, skeptical. "Like what?" "Like someone you didn't expect. Showing up when you need them most." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the building's old heating system. Somewhere down the hall, an intercom announced visiting hours were ending. Ethan didn't know what the surgery would bring or how he'd feel when it was over. But he knew one thing. Walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. When Ethan woke, the first thing he noticed wasn't the pain. It was the quiet. No hum of phone notifications, no muffled boardroom chatter in the background, no pressure of a clock counting down to his next deal. Just the low rhythm of hospital machines and the faint beeping from somewhere down the hall. The ceiling above him was a soft beige, the kind that could belong to any hospital in any small town in America. He could hear a janitor's cart rolling past, the faint squeak of the wheels, and the muted voices of two nurses talking about the chili cook-off at the fire station next weekend. His throat was dry. His side ached where the bandages pulled against his skin. But when he turned his head, he saw Caleb standing there, hands shoved into the pocket of his sweatshirt, eyes fixed on him. "You're awake," the boy said. Ethan gave a small smile. Looks that way. Caleb stepped closer, hesitated like he was still deciding if it was okay to be there. You saved her, he said quietly. For a moment, Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. He swallowed, nodded once. How's she doing? She's sleeping. The doctor said, it's working. Her numbers are better already. Caleb's voice cracked a little and he looked down, pretending to study the tiled floor. Ethan let his head sink back into the pillow. The words settled into him slowly, like warm sunlight on cold skin. He'd had plenty of victories in his life. Deals closed, rivals beaten, buildings with his name on them, but none of them felt like this. This was quieter, deeper. No one was going to write a press release about this. There wouldn't be a plaque in his honor or a line in his biography. But lying there, in a plain hospital room with no wealth or titles, Ethan felt more complete than he ever did at the height of his career. A nurse came in to check his vitals. She was friendly in that small-town way, calling him Han without thinking about it, telling him he'd better rest up if he wanted to beat the visiting hours cutoff for seeing Mary later. She reminded him of the women who worked the ticket booth at the county fair. Efficient, but always ready with a little kindness, the sort of thing you only noticed once you slowed down long enough to appreciate it. Later that afternoon, Caleb came back with 2 paper cups from the cafeteria. It's just cocoa, he said, setting one on the tray beside Ethan's bed. The coffee here tastes like burned dirt. Ethan chuckled. Hospital coffee usually does. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes. Outside the window, the snow was starting to fall again, dusting the parking lot. A county plow rumbled past, clearing the main road, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. Caleb broke the silence first. You could have just not done it. Nobody would have blamed you. Ethan sipped his cocoa, letting the sweetness cut through the dryness in his throat. Maybe not. But I would have blamed me. The boy's eyes flicked to his, and for once there was no suspicion there. Just a quiet understanding. That evening, Ethan finally got to see Mary. She was pale, but her color was better than before, her breathing steady. She gave him a weak smile. You didn't have to go this far, she whispered. Maybe I didn't, he said. But I wanted to. Her hand found his, squeezed it lightly. Then thank you, from both of us. When the nurse ushered him out to let her rest, Ethan found himself lingering in the hallway. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and the spaghetti dinner someone had reheated in the staff lounge. The walls were lined with faded photographs, softball teams, PTA bake sales, the mayor shaking hands with the high school valedictorian. The kind of stuff he used to walk past without even noticing. Now, each frame felt like a little piece of the world Mary and Caleb were part of, the world he'd once helped bulldoze in the name of progress. And for the first time, he wondered how much of what he'd built had actually been worth the cost. Before bed that night, Caleb stopped by one more time. He was holding a folded piece of paper. Mary wanted me to give you this. Ethan unfolded it. Inside was a photo, old and slightly faded, of Mary standing in front of her house before it was torn down. Caleb was there too, younger and grinning, holding a little league trophy. Behind them, the yard was full of neighbors, lawn chairs set up like they were having a block party. That was the last summer before they started tearing everything down, Caleb said quietly. Ethan traced the edges of the picture with his thumb. You had a good thing there. Yeah, Caleb said. We did. The boy didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. The unspoken was loud enough. You can't bring back what's gone, but maybe you can stop the next thing from being lost. When the lights dimmed in the hallway and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Ethan lay back and let the exhaustion finally take him. His side still hurt, and he knew recovery wouldn't be quick. But as he drifted off, there was no trace of the emptiness that used to follow him home after every so-called victory. This time, there was only peace. The next time Ethan came to the shelter, there was no checkbook in his pocket, no briefcase in his hand. Instead, the back of his SUV was packed to the roof. Grocery bags, boxes of winter coats, a few heavy-duty toolboxes. The kind of load you'd see a dad hauling on a Saturday morning before tackling a weekend of home repairs. It was cold enough that the frost on the chain-link fence outside hadn't melted yet. He could see his breath as he carried the first bags in. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the smell of chili simmering somewhere in the back kitchen. Mary was in the main room, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her voice soft but steady as she spoke to a young mom holding a toddler. She looked better, still pale, but stronger. And she smiled faintly when she saw Ethan. "You found the place again," she said. "Didn't have to look far this time," he replied. "Brought a few things." Caleb was by the wall, stacking boxes of canned goods another volunteer had brought in. He didn't come over, just glanced at Ethan briefly, like a man checking the weather, measuring if it was safe to go out or if a storm was brewing. Ethan didn't push. He set the bags down on the long folding table that doubled as a pantry counter. The other volunteers began unloading them: fresh fruit, boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter, milk, eggs, the kind of staples that could stretch into a week's worth of meals if you knew how to make every bit count. Before anyone could thank him, he slipped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. "What needs doing?" An older man with a ball cap pointed toward the back door. "Fence out by the playground's got a busted section. Kids can squeeze through." "Been meaning to fix it, but I'll take a look," Ethan said. Outside, the wind cut sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The fence sagged in the corner, two posts leaning like tired men. He fetched his tools from the car and got to work, pulling on gloves, driving new screws, tightening the wire mesh. Every so often, kids would peek around the corner to watch him. A little girl in a pink puffer coat asked if he was building a fort. He smiled and told her it was kind of like that, just keeping the bad stuff out. When the fence stood straight again, he brushed the dirt from his jeans and headed inside. Lunch prep was in full swing now. The long tables were lined with plates, and the clatter of spoons and laughter of kids filled the room. "Need an extra pair of hands?" he asked the woman ladling chili into bowls. "Always," she said, sliding over to make room. He served quietly, making sure each plate had a roll, a scoop of salad, a generous pour of chili. Every so often he caught Caleb watching him from across the room. The boy didn't look away, but he didn't approach either. His gaze was steady, not hostile, but curious, like he was trying to decide if this was a one-off performance or something real. After the meal, Ethan sat at one of the tables, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. A man with deep lines in his face sat across from him, cradling his own cup like it was the only warm thing he'd had all day. "Used to work the mill," the man said without prompting. 40 years. Then they shut it down. Said they were modernizing operations. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Modernizing meant moving to Mexico. Ethan listened, really listened. He didn't offer solutions or hollow encouragements. He just let the man talk. Story after story followed. Families losing homes after hospital bills piled up, women working 2 jobs and still having to choose between rent and groceries. Kids moving from school to school because they couldn't stay in one place long enough. By the time the sun dipped low outside, turning the frost on the windows to gold, Ethan had hammered loose nails back into the shelter's front steps, sorted a pile of donated clothes, and helped set up cots for the night. His muscles ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that told you the work mattered. As he was leaving, Caleb stepped into his path. For a moment, they just stood there, the air between them filled with the quiet sounds of the shelter winding down for the night. "You're still here," Caleb said finally. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Planning to be back tomorrow too." The boy didn't nod, didn't smile, but his eyes softened just enough for Ethan to see it, the first crack in the wall. Walking to his car, Ethan realized something. All his life, he'd measured worth by numbers: contracts signed, profits earned, square footage built. But here, it wasn't about numbers. It was about faces, names, stories. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, he wasn't thinking about what he could take from a place. He was thinking about what he could leave behind. It was a Tuesday morning in late February, the kind where the cold doesn't bite so much as it seeps into your bones. The shelter's parking lot was still slick from last night's freezing rain, but Ethan parked in his usual spot anyway, careful not to slide into the dented blue minivan beside him. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, engine idling, staring at the envelope in his hand. Heavy cardstock. A check inside, $1 million, written in crisp blue ink. No conditions, no contracts, just a name on the pay to the order of line, Caleb Carter. When he finally stepped out, he was greeted by the familiar muffled thud of activity inside. The shelter's main hall always smelled of brewed coffee and fresh laundry in the mornings, with a hint of floor cleaner. People were moving, stacking chairs, organizing breakfast plates, a toddler laughing somewhere near the corner. Mary spotted him first. "Morning, stranger," she said, voice raspy but warm. She was wearing a navy sweater with a small hole at the elbow, her hair pinned up in a way that looked like it had been done in a rush. "Morning," Ethan replied, holding the envelope behind his back like a kid hiding a surprise. Caleb was by the pantry shelves, restocking boxes of cereal. He didn't look up until Ethan was halfway across the room. When he did, his expression didn't change, just that same guarded, unreadable stare. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, stopping a few feet away, "about what I promised you." A few of the volunteers slowed their work, sensing something brewing. Conversations dimmed. The scrape of a chair leg against the floor echoed louder than it should have. Ethan held out the envelope. $1 million. "It's yours." Caleb took it without breaking eye contact. His fingers were steady, but the silence in the room seemed to press in from all sides. He tore the flap open and slid out the check. The printed number caught in the overhead light, the kind of sum that could erase most people's worries in one stroke. For a second, there was nothing but the faint sound of the coffee pot dripping in the background. Then Caleb's hands moved, slowly at first, then with a deliberate finality. He tore the check straight down the middle. Gasps rippled through the room. He tore it again and again until the pieces were no bigger than confetti. The scraps fluttered to the floor like brittle leaves. "Debts paid," he said, voice level, almost quiet. Ethan froze. Around them, people stared, some with wide eyes, others with subtle, knowing nods, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. One man muttered something under his breath, but nobody moved to pick up the pieces. Mary's eyes were on her grandson, not Ethan. There was pride there, and maybe a little sadness. Ethan felt the heat crawl up his neck, the way it had during his first failed pitch back in his 20s. It wasn't anger, though. It was something closer to exposure. Like Caleb had reached into his chest, pulled out whatever was left of the old Ethan, and laid it bare for everyone to see. For years, money had been his language, his shield, his weapon. It could smooth over awkward meetings, dissolve grudges, buy silence, or secure loyalty. But here, right here in a cramped shelter's dining hall, it was just paper. Paper that meant nothing to the one person he was trying to reach. A little girl, no older than 6, bent down to pick up one of the shredded pieces. She turned it over in her mittened hand, then let it fall again when she realized it wasn't part of a game. Caleb stepped past Ethan without another word, heading toward the back hallway. Ethan started to follow but stopped himself. This wasn't a negotiation. There was no counteroffer to make. Instead, he crouched down and began picking up the pieces. One by one. No rush, no drama, just a quiet task. A few others joined in. The sound of paper crinkling under fingers filled the silence until the floor was clear. When he stood, Mary was beside him. "He's not trying to humiliate you," she said softly. "He's telling you the truth. You can't buy your way into this family. You have to earn it." Ethan nodded once, tucking the paper shreds into his pocket. "Guess I've got more work to do." By the time he left that morning, the room had gone back to its normal rhythm. Volunteers talking over coffee, kids weaving between tables, the low hum of a place that keeps going no matter who comes or goes. But something had shifted. Not just for Ethan. For everyone who'd seen the moment unfold, it was proof that this wasn't about wealth or charity. It was about something that couldn't be bought, measured, or signed over with a pen. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like the man in control of the story. He felt like the man being written into it. The news broke in the local paper before Ethan even had the chance to tell Mary himself. Former CEO buys back land for community rebuild. The headline sat above a grainy photo of him at a county auction, shaking hands with a man in a cowboy hat. The kind of handshake that looked more like an agreement to bury an old grudge than a real estate deal. It wasn't a publicity stunt. He didn't call a press conference, didn't issue a statement. In fact, the only reason the paper knew was because in a town this size, word traveled faster than coffee cooled. He'd sold off stock options, liquidated a couple of out-of-state properties he'd never even visited. It was enough to buy back the very parcels where Mary's neighborhood once stood. Streets that now were just open dirt lots, choked with weeds and litter from people cutting across. The first morning he went out to the site, it was just him, a rented backhoe, and 2 volunteers from the shelter. The air smelled faintly of diesel and wet earth. Ethan stood there, staring at the empty land, imagining the rows of houses that used to stand. Some of the driveways were still visible, cracked and split by weeds, leading to nothing. He didn't hire a big construction firm. Instead, he reached out to the local Habitat for Humanity chapter, the Carpenters Union, and even the high school shop class. At first, some folks wouldn't take his calls. Old bitterness dies hard, but one by one, people started showing up, some out of curiosity, others out of a stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, he meant it this time. The first workday felt like a mix between a barn raising and a small-town block party, folding tables with coffee and donuts, tool belts slung over flannel shirts, old country on a tinny radio, and Ethan, right in the middle of it, mud on his boots, learning how to frame a wall from a man named Leroy who'd been swinging a hammer since the Nixon years. He was clumsy at first. The nail gun startled him. He bent more nails than he drove straight. But he kept at it, sweating through his sweatshirt even in the cool morning air. Some of the moments stuck with him in ways he didn't expect. Like when Mrs. Alvarez, who used to live 2 streets over, brought over a tray of tamales for the workers. She'd once yelled at him outside a zoning meeting, calling him a land thief loud enough for half the council to hear. But here she was now, smiling shyly, asking if he wanted red or green sauce. Or when Tom Pearson, once the loudest critic of the condo project, walked up with a battered thermos of coffee and handed it to him without a word. The 2 men stood there for a moment, sipping, neither pretending the past hadn't happened. It wasn't all warm fuzzies. There were still cold shoulders, still folks who'd cross the street rather than walk past him. At the county board meeting that month, a few members pushed to delay building permits, citing infrastructure concerns. Everyone knew it was politics, leftover resentment dressed up in bureaucratic language. But Ethan showed up in person, wearing work jeans and a hoodie, not a suit. He stood at the podium, speaking plainly about his intentions. No grand speeches, just the facts. The funding, the volunteer hours, the plan for affordable housing. He could see the shift in the room, not total trust, but a recognition that this wasn't the same man from the ribbon-cutting photo years ago. Workdays blurred together. He learned to cut siding, mix concrete, and, more importantly, listen. Lunch breaks turned into story hours, volunteers swapping memories about the old neighborhood. Some remembered summer evenings on their porches, kids chasing fireflies in the street. Others talked about the sting of eviction notices, the humiliation of packing up under a neighbor's watchful eye. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Marcus, helping with his uncle, asked Ethan why he didn't just pay someone to do all this faster. Ethan wiped the sawdust from his hands, thought for a second, and said, "Because the work changes me more than it changes the place." By late spring, the first framed walls began to rise, their outlines cutting against the sky like promises. Local businesses started donating materials, paint from the hardware store, insulation from a construction supply company. The diner down the road sent over sandwiches on Fridays. The day the first roof went up, Mary came to watch. She stood off to the side, leaning on her cane, her eyes scanning the half-built street like she could already see the porches and gardens. Ethan walked over to her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Looks different already," she said. "Still a long way to go," he replied. Mary's gaze softened. "Long way's fine, as long as you're walking it with the rest of us." It was then, over the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh-cut lumber, that Ethan felt the shift. Not forgiveness, not fully, but a kind of shared ownership. He wasn't just building houses, he was building his place back into the fabric of the town. And that's when the neighbor with the coffee, Tom Pearson, walked over again. This time, he didn't just hand Ethan the thermos. He poured 2 cups, passed one over, and said, "Figured you've earned a refill." For a man who'd once been called the most ruthless developer in the county, that simple gesture felt bigger than any deal he'd ever closed. The ribbon cutting wasn't a big city affair. No glossy invitations, no mayor with a polished speech. Instead, the opening of the Mary Carter Center looked a lot like a Saturday block party. Folding chairs lined the sidewalk, paper streamers hung between lampposts, and the smell of barbecue drifted from the church lot next door. Ethan stood under the shade of a young maple, watching the crowd gather. He'd insisted on naming the center after Mary, despite her protests. She'd argued, half joking, half serious, that it made her sound like she'd gone and died already. But deep down, she knew why he'd done it. Her name wasn't just a tribute, it was a promise. The building itself used to be an abandoned grocery store, the kind with faded paint and a cracked parking lot where weeds pushed through the asphalt. Now, wide glass doors welcomed visitors into a bright, airy space. The smell of fresh paint still lingered, mingling with the faint scent of sawdust from the carpenters who'd been putting up bookshelves that morning. Inside, the first thing anyone saw was the wall plaque. It was simple, polished brass on a dark walnut backing. Just a few words. For those who choose to repair what they once broke. No names. No logos. Ethan wanted the sentiment to stand on its own. The center was more than just a building. It had a small library corner for tutoring, a kitchen that could serve hot meals, and 2 exam rooms for volunteer nurses and doctors. In one corner, donated laptops sat on long tables, ready for kids to use for homework. There was even a modest playground out back. Bright blue slides, a swing set, and a basketball hoop where the parking lot used to be. Ethan had spent months in county meetings wrangling over permits, convincing skeptical board members, and pushing through budget hurdles. There'd been whispers that he was just trying to polish his image. Some still believed that. But he'd stopped arguing with people's opinions. The work, he figured, would speak louder than his defense ever could. When the crowd quieted, Mary took the microphone. She didn't read from notes. Mary never needed them. "This place isn't charity," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It's a place for building, for learning, for taking care of each other. And it's proof that people can change, if they want to bad enough." Her eyes flicked toward Ethan for just a second. It was enough to make his throat tighten. Then, before the ribbon was cut, someone in the crowd caught Ethan's eye. A boy, maybe 12 or 13, standing a little apart from the others. Caleb. He'd grown a bit taller in the months since they'd met, his shoulders less hunched, but he still had that watchful look, like he was weighing the worth of every person in the room. Ethan saw him hesitate at the entrance. For a moment, he thought Caleb might turn and leave, but then the boy stepped forward, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Without saying a word, he walked over to the wall plaque, running his fingers slowly across the engraved letters. Ethan stood a few steps away, feeling like he'd been caught holding his breath. There was something almost ceremonial in the way Caleb touched the plaque, as if he wasn't just reading it, but testing its weight, its truth. "You did this?" Caleb finally asked, not looking away from the words. Ethan nodded. "For you. For everyone here." Caleb's lips twitched. Almost a smile, but not quite. "Guess we'll see if it holds up." The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a mix of laughter, conversation, and small, meaningful moments. Kids darted in and out of the building, testing the swings and grabbing snacks from the kitchen. A retired teacher volunteered to start reading sessions twice a week. A local nurse signed up to handle the first round of free health checkups. Ethan spent most of the time listening, really listening. A grandmother told him about her grandson's struggle in school. A young single father asked if the center could help him study for his GED. A couple of teenagers wanted to start a basketball league in the parking lot. At one point, the county councilman who'd fought him hardest over the zoning walked up. "Didn't think you'd pull this off," he admitted, shaking Ethan's hand. "Guess I was wrong." Ethan didn't gloat. "I was wrong about a lot of things too," he replied simply. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the playground, Ethan found himself standing outside alone. Through the open doors, he could hear Caleb's laugh for the first time. Not the guarded, polite chuckle he'd heard before, but a genuine, unrestrained laugh. That sound hit him harder than any public praise could have. It wasn't the end of the story. He knew trust took years, not months, but it felt like the first page of a new chapter. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was chasing redemption. He felt like he was living it. The park didn't look anything like it had the first time Ethan wheeled through it in his chair all those years ago. Back then, the place was tired. Rusted swings, graffiti on the slide, and a basketball court with nets long gone. These days, it was alive. The city had finally approved a renovation project, and with the help of local volunteers, the park now had fresh turf, bright red and blue playground equipment, and a small community stage where a brass quartet was playing jingle bells under a canopy wrapped in Christmas lights. Snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals, catching in the glow of the lampposts. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the cider stand and wood smoke from a fire pit where kids were toasting marshmallows. Ethan stood by a folding table stacked with wrapped toys, wearing a wool cap pulled low over his ears and a scarf that Mary had knitted for him years earlier. His hands were raw from the cold, but he didn't mind. Beside him, Caleb, now taller than Ethan by an inch, was handing out boxes of Legos, plush animals, and a few battered but still working bicycles that a local mechanic had refurbished. They'd been working side by side all afternoon, slipping into a rhythm without needing to talk much. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the shuffle of boots on snow-dusted pavement. Parents offered quick thanks before being pulled away by their excited kids. Halfway through the line, a little girl stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 7, bundled in a puffy purple coat with a missing zipper pull. Her mittens didn't match, one red, one blue, and she clutched a stuffed bunny so worn the fur had gone flat. Ethan knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Hey there. Merry Christmas. What's your name?" "Sophia," she said softly. "Well, Sophia, what do you think of this one?" He held up a brightly wrapped box just her size. She took it without tearing the paper, holding it like something fragile. Then she looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Thank you," she said, with a kind of quiet conviction that stopped him cold. It was the same tone Caleb had used all those years ago in the park, not loud, not showy, but carrying a weight beyond her years. Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat. "You're welcome," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. As she walked away, Caleb gave him a sidelong glance, as if he'd caught the echo too. But neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The rest of the afternoon rolled on in waves of warmth, despite the chill. The local high school choir arrived to sing carols. A group of teenagers from the community center passed out cups of cocoa. Someone fired up a portable speaker for a little impromptu dance-off near the playground. Mary was there too, sitting in a folding chair with a blanket over her lap, greeting everyone who passed as if they were old friends. Every now and then she'd catch Ethan's eye and give him that knowing smile, the one that said she saw through him, even now. Around sunset, the line for toys finally thinned. Ethan took a step back from the table, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Caleb was already helping a volunteer pack up the extras to deliver to families who couldn't make it out tonight. "Remember the first time we met here?" Ethan asked, his gaze drifting toward the bench where it had all begun. It had been replaced with a new one, smooth wood slats, fresh paint, but he still saw the ghost of the old splintered boards in his mind. Caleb didn't answer right away. He finished stacking a box, closed the lid, and only then looked over. "Yeah, I remember you thinking you were the most important guy in the park." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I wasn't, though. Not even close." "No," Caleb agreed, but there was no bite in his voice, just a kind of gentle teasing. The brass quartet switched to Silent Night, and for a moment, the music seemed to soften the edges of the cold. Parents lingered with their kids, reluctant to leave the glow of the lights and the feeling that, just for tonight, everything was okay. Ethan took it all in. The laughter, the chatter, the scent of pine from the wreaths hanging on the lampposts. He thought about the years between then and now, the mistakes, the rebuilding, the moments when it would have been easier to walk away. This park had been the starting line for his worst days and, strangely enough, for the life he was living now. Coming back here, not for himself, but for the kids who'd grow up playing where he once sat bitter and broken. It felt like closing a loop he hadn't known was still open. As the night wound down, Sophia returned with her parents to say goodnight. She waved, the bunny now tucked under one arm and the gift under the other. "Merry Christmas," she called, her voice bright in the crisp air. Ethan waved back, feeling that same quiet conviction settle in his chest. Not the desperate kind that comes from needing to prove something, but the steady kind that grows from knowing you've done what you could and that it mattered. Caleb stepped up beside him, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Looks like you're stuck with this place," he said, glancing around at the park, the people, the lights. "Yeah," Ethan replied, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The music swelled, voices joined in the last verse of Silent Night, and snow began to fall again, soft, quiet, unhurried. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the cold. He just felt home. The auditorium smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee from the staff lounge down the hall. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow over rows of folding chairs filled with squirming middle schoolers. Career Day banners hung crooked along the stage, their bold letters flapping a little every time someone opened the side door to let in the cold November air. Ethan had chosen a seat in the very back row, near the exit. He wasn't here to be seen. He just wanted to watch, to take it in. His coat was still damp from the drizzle outside, and he clasped his hands together in his lap to keep from fidgeting. On stage, a string of adults had already cycled through their presentations. Firefighters showing off their gear, a local baker passing out sugar cookies, a police officer explaining traffic safety. The kids clapped politely after each one, though some were clearly more interested in whispering to their friends than listening. Then, the principal stepped up to the microphone. "Our next speaker is someone very special to our community. He's a student here, but today, he's also going to share his dream with all of you. Please welcome Caleb Carter." The applause was scattered at first, just a few claps here and there, but it grew as Caleb appeared from the wings. He was taller now, lean in the way teenage boys are before they fill out, and his hair had grown into a longer, tousled style that made him look older than 16. But it wasn't his height or his hair that made the room quiet. It was the oversized white lab coat he wore, the sleeves rolled up twice so his hands could poke through. Caleb walked to the podium without glancing at the audience. His steps were measured, his back straight. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat once, and said, "My name is Caleb Carter. I'm going to be a doctor." The words hung in the air for a beat. Ethan felt the breath catch in his chest. Caleb went on, his voice steady. "When I was younger, I saw someone I loved get sick. I wanted to help them, but I couldn't. I didn't understand why. I promised myself that when I was older, I'd learn everything I could so I'd never feel that helpless again, and so I could help other people feel less helpless too." There was a murmur from the audience, one of those unplanned reactions that comes when a room full of people realize they're hearing something real, not just a school assignment. Ethan's fingers dug into the worn fabric of his coat pocket. He remembered that night at the shelter, the panic in Caleb's voice, the way he'd whispered, "Why did it work for you and not her?" That question had lit a fire in him back then. Now it was lighting one in this room. Caleb smiled a little, almost shyly. "I don't come from a family of doctors. I don't have all the answers, but I have people who believed in me, even when they didn't have to, and because of them, I believe I can do this." His eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment, they landed on Ethan. It wasn't a long look, just enough for their gazes to meet before Caleb moved on. But it was enough to send a wave of warmth through Ethan, the kind that made his throat tight. "I want to work in places where people can't always get the care they need," Caleb continued. "Places where the hospital is too far or the cost is too high. I want to bring that care to them instead of making them come to it." In the second row, a teacher dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A couple of 8th graders stopped whispering and leaned forward in their seats. Even the principal, perched on the edge of the stage, seemed to be listening harder now. Caleb wrapped up with a quiet but certain, "So if you ever think where you come from decides where you're going, remember this, it doesn't. You decide that, and I've decided to heal." The applause that followed wasn't scattered this time. It was loud, sustained. A few kids even stood. Ethan clapped too, slow at first, then joining in with everyone else. He kept his head down, blinking hard. Pride swelled in him, sharp and sweet all at once. When the program ended and the students began filing out for lunch, Ethan stayed in his seat. He watched Caleb step down from the stage, greeted by a small knot of classmates and a couple of teachers who shook his hand. The boy took it all in with quiet grace, not letting it turn into a performance. Mary was waiting near the door, her cane in one hand and a smile that could melt the first frost of winter. She caught Ethan's eye, and for a moment, The years between then and now collapsed into a single truth. They had made it here together. As Caleb approached, the white coat swishing around his knees, Ethan felt something shift. This wasn't just the next step in Caleb's life. It was the next chapter in a story they'd been writing for a long time. And while Ethan had been part of the beginning, the rest belonged to the boy in the lab coat. Caleb stopped in front of him. "You came. Wouldn't miss it," Ethan said, his voice low so it wouldn't break. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb's mouth curved into a small smile, the same one he'd worn in the park all those years ago, when he'd first offered help without asking for anything in return. And in that moment, Ethan knew, without a doubt, that everything they'd been through had been leading here. To this room, this day, this kid with the steady voice and the unshakable dream. This piece works beautifully as an emotional coda to the earlier scenes. It closes Ethan's arc without making it feel neatly tied up, which is exactly what gives it weight. A few things stand out. Strengths. Quiet, earned intimacy. The scene between Ethan and Caleb isn't grand or sentimental in a forced way. The pauses, the unsaid things, and the small physical details, folding the coat, standing in the wind, make their connection feel authentic. Consistent imagery of rebuilding. From the board meeting at the center to the people who could stand taller, the metaphor of reconstruction threads cleanly through the whole piece and reinforces the theme without hammering it. Forward-looking legacy. The way you project Ethan's influence into the future, maybe one day Caleb would wear a real white coat, gives the ending scope without losing the intimacy. It's a satisfying emotional payoff. Suggestions for tightening and deepening. You could shave a few sentences where you explain Ethan's transformation too directly. His shift from skyscrapers to lives is powerful, but it might hit harder if more of that is left implied through earlier actions and memories. The moment when Caleb thanks Ethan could gain even more weight if his words had a slight catch or hesitation, something that hints it's not easy for him to say out loud, even now. The last paragraph is strong, but you might consider ending on the word lives, rather than the preceding sentence, letting it echo as the final beat. If you're thinking about this as part of a longer sequence, this feels like the chapter that could bridge the active redemption phase of Ethan's life to a quieter, legacy-focused phase. It's got a tone of resolution, but also an open door. Do you want me to show you a slightly more concise, sharper-edged revision that keeps the emotional bones intact, but lets some of the meaning breathe between the lines? This closing reflection works well as a thematic bow on the story. It's heartfelt, clear, and connects Ethan's fictional journey to the viewer's real-world experience. A couple of things you've done especially well. Universal takeaway. You've distilled Ethan's arc into a concise moral. It's not what you have, it's what you do with it that feels both timeless and personal. Call to action. Inviting viewers to share their own stories keeps the conversation going and builds a sense of community. Emotional cadence, the rhythm of the final blessing, peace in the chaos, hope in the struggle, is poetic and leaves a lingering warmth. If you wanted to make it even more resonant for a video audience, you could. Tighten the opening sentence so it hits faster. Something like, "True wealth isn't in what you own, it's in the lives you change." Add a one-line callback to Caleb, even without retelling his story. A subtle reference would anchor the lesson in the character we've just connected with. Break the last paragraph into shorter beats for better pacing in a spoken delivery. If you want, I can give you a reworked outro that keeps the warmth but makes it even more punchy for a voiceover or video format. That way, it lands with the same weight as the story itself. Would you like me to do that?